At this time, we have a few words by Jason DeMello in memory of Fred, so I invite Jason to come up.
$1,800,042. This is the number of exclamation points that Dr. Willard Frederick Kiesner probably used throughout his lifetime. Dr. Kiesner, who preferred to be called Grandpa Fred, invented his own version of text-to-voice long before artificial intelligence, simply through the generous use of punctuation and all caps. Just reading a letter from Grandpa Fred could stop you in your tracks. It could warm your heart and bring you to laughter at the exact same time. He had an unusual sense of humor, an incredible wit, and overwhelming compassion. His words, written or spoken, would indeed change your life. I knew from the moment I met Grandpa Fred that my life would never be the same. But my story is only one of thousands. You see, Grandpa Fred had an impact on anyone that came across his path. If you ever walk down the street with him, you know you would never get too far, and you never get there on time, because he wanted to stop and make every stranger smile along the way. And perhaps his biggest success, among all the remarkable achievements in his illustrious career, was not what Grandpa Fred said or did, but how he made people feel. Being with Grandpa Fred just for a few minutes, even if it was email, phone, or if you were lucky in person, would always bring value to your life. Of course, his legacy and compassion will live long after his 86 years. And Dr. David Choi, who leads the Fred Kiesner Center for Entrepreneurship, wrote a beautiful piece that's on our website that describes his career much better than I can in the time that I have today. But in his letter, he shared that our program is probably the only endowed entrepreneurship program in the world named after a professor by their student. He wasn't always a professor. He was a millionaire at 31 and flat broke at 34. There was a dock strike, and it shut down his business in the import-export business, but he and his partners kept paying their employees during the holidays, and he walked away from that business with $75 in a tiny cabin in the mountains. It was then that he suffered his first heart attack. His daughter, Andrea, was less than a year old. The doctors told him he had less than 6 months to live, he should go on welfare, and get his affairs in order. But Grandpa Fred, the proud old Irishman that he was, ignored that advice, and he discovered a new passion for education. And he decided to live for about 50 more years. He quickly learned that he was a naturally gifted teacher. He had a knack for helping small businesses, and he worked with the SBA, and that's when he first came here to LMU in 1973. Professor Gary Sybeck asked him if he knew anybody who could teach a class on how to start a business. And Grandpa Fred, the entrepreneur, stood up, extended his right hand, and reintroduced himself. And that's when he became Fred Kiesner, the professor. He spent the next 4 decades here at LMU. He had a few more heart attacks, he battled with cancer, but somehow Professor Kiesner always made it to class on time. And when he wasn't on campus, he was up in the mountains. He built his house with his own hands, expanding that tiny little cabin into a whimsical estate for his family to live in. He became a leader in the local community. He volunteered to fight fires, and he ran the local newspaper, the Mountain Express. He loved to fix hot rods, and he was known to some as Fearless Freddy and the Seat Cover King, but that's a whole nother story. He was notorious for nicknames, and he came up for some brilliant ones from his students, like Chuck Norris, Father Tom, Michelob, and Turkey Breath, and some that I can't say today. He knew that entrepreneurs weren't always the best students in the classroom, and they had limited attention spans, so he came up with fun and entertaining ways like wearing chicken costumes to class or dressing up like Santa Claus. He was a natural teacher and a brilliant storyteller. His stories helped us believe in ourselves, take risks, be courageous and humble, treat people with respect, never ask somebody to do a job that you wouldn't do yourself, have integrity and honor, and dream and envision the future that you want to live in and take action quickly in the present. He told us to solve problems instead of complain about them. He wanted us to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves, to keep our eyes open for opportunities, and stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful people we met, and then go sit on a rock or soar when life got tough. And he also told us never to take ourselves too seriously, to answer our own phones, thank people who help us, and then throw the rope over the wall and help the next person back up. He was the only professor I've ever met to talk openly about their failures. And he did that, I think, to relieve us of the anxiety that we had for the uncertainty of our own futures. He insisted that we call him Grandpa Fred, and in return, he called us his kids. Grandpa Fred was a father figure to many of his students, but he was a family man first and foremost. He was a devoted husband, brother, father, and of course, grandfather. In fact, today's memorial service was planned so that his grandson, Stevie, a staff sergeant in the Air Force, could attend. Grandpa Fred was so proud of all his grandchildren and their military service, including Jeremiah, Jared, and Katrina. And he loved his son-in-law, Yogi, who he affectionately called Yogurt. He absolutely adored his daughter, Andrea. She won the Marion Award here at LMU and was president of the Ignatians, eventually following in her father's footsteps to be a teacher. And one of Grandpa Fred's favorite titles of all time was simply being called Andrea's dad. That was a nickname he got after he came back from his sabbatical when she was already at LMU as a freshman. She told me that her dad, even though he was a father figure to so many people, she never felt like she had to share him because there was so much of his heart to go around. Next July will mark 60 years since Grandpa Fred married the love of his life, Elaine. Grandma Elaine, also a lifetime teacher, was his partner in every sense of the word. She was with him in class for many years, and they traveled the world together, building an incredible life and running our program. They were the perfect team. She became his external hard drive when his memory started to run out. The only time I ever saw Grandpa Fred without Grandma Elaine was when she was in the hospital about 9 years ago. And this was the first time I ever saw him feel helpless and powerless. He would have done anything to trade places with her in that moment. And he said while crying in my arms that it was his job to fix things, but he didn't know how to fix Grandma Elaine. And I watched in awe as this amazing couple survived during the most challenging times over the next decade, taking turns nursing each other back to health. But they never lost that special sense of humor and the pure joy you see when you look in their eyes. You see, it was that happiness and joy that I saw in Grandpa Fred's eyes that inspired me, too, to become a professor during my time at LMU. You're probably wondering why I'm wearing a graduation outfit to a memorial service. Well, the story is that on the day before the Kentucky Derby, just as I was entering my last year of a PhD program in Louisville, I suffered a major injury and had to go for surgery. Right before the surgery, which was going to send me back for months on my dissertation, Grandpa Fred found out, and he sent me a note, and he said, "Hey, dummy, I dig you wanting to use some of my teaching stuff, but a broken leg?" See, Grandpa Fred had broken his leg, too, falling on the ice just before that, and that was the injury that would lead him into retirement. So on May 14th, 2013, a massive box showed up at my door, and inside that box was this graduation gown. It was Grandpa Fred's regalia from his PhD in 1984. It was handed down to him from his mentor, and it's almost 100 years old. It arrived with a note encouraging me to get back on my feet and that he better see me wearing it soon. All caps and dozens of exclamation points. Next year will be my 10th year wearing this gown as a professor here at LMU. In many of those years, Grandpa Fred came back to my class as a guest speaker, and he was the most popular guest. Even during COVID, at the age of 83, he figured out how to use Zoom. And even though he didn't know how to press mute, and he didn't know he was always on, the kids loved him. And he managed to get all of them to turn their cameras on and connected with them. And he loved them, they loved him, and even through the screen, they felt his passion. Grandpa Fred passed away on April 26th in his own home, surrounded by family, peacefully looking at a photo of Jesus while Mass was being streamed on television on EWTN. I was about to take stage at the Incubator Showcase with 300 people in the audience who all came out to root for Grandpa Fred's kids pitching their businesses, and we all said a prayer for him together. His last words to me a few days before that was, "I'm at peace with you, Jason. You're a good man and I love you." Probably all caps and exclamations too. I want to close with one more story though, and I think this is the best example of the type of man that Grandpa Fred was. Now you remember in 2010, he published a book called Creating Entrepreneurs and Making Miracles Happen. It's very difficult to buy this book today. So in recent years, Grandpa Fred started giving away his personal copies. And the last copy he signed was gifted to a handyman named Ivan, who fixed his roof last year. After Grandpa Fred passed away, his wife Elaine contacted Ivan to ask him to take a photo of what was signed in the book, because she thought it might be the last thing that Grandpa Fred ever wrote. After Grandma Elaine called Ivan, he realized that he actually had 2 copies of the book. Grandpa Fred, the generous man who could never stop teaching, had actually given another book to Ivan's son, who was a budding young entrepreneur. And when he saw it, he knew that he had to quickly return it. So he went to the Kiesner home, and he handed the book to Grandma Elaine, but he asked her to sit down before opening it. Grandma Elaine sat down, she opened the book, and it read, "To my love, partner, friend, and total supporter, thank you for a grand trip through life. It has been wonderful because of you." Grandpa Fred, the compassionate, generous, and romantic man that he was, found the most magical and perhaps unintentional way to share his last words and one last exclamation point.